friends. Welcome to the Echo Podcast, where we discuss how our hearts and minds can be an echo of God's heart and mind and what that even means in this world. We're Pastor Dan Sinkhorn and Adrienne Tarullo, and welcome to the show where we talk about the Insurgence. Now, this is a book written by Frank Viola. We hope that you listened to last week's episode so you get a good foundation of what we're going to be talking about here. So we're just going to jump right in with some really rich content here today. So Frank really kind of does the same thing in his Insurgence book. He just kind of like jumps right in. And so today we're going to be talking about some distorted gospels, which is kind of an interesting place to start, I think. But Pastor Dan's going to give us a little clarity here in just a second of why might we be talking about distorted gospels before talking about the real, the one true gospel. Take it away, Pastor D.
Well, this is as old as the New Testament itself. I mean, the problem of a distorted gospel is that it existed even when Jesus was preaching it. The first distorted gospel was the one where people said, "You're not doing what we think you should do, Jesus. We think you should take control of the world and reclaim the throne of David. We think you should, draw lightning down from heaven and destroy all of your enemies. We think that you are preaching the wrong gospel, and here he is, the gospel himself, he's the one." And so distorted gospels are those interpretations of what we think ought to be God's plan, what we think God ought to be doing, and how we think God should do it. And that's, typical Dan, right? I'm giving you my 20,000 foot view and then coming back down here to earth where we are. And so in this context of the Insurgence book, what Frank is doing is he's narrowing it down to basically three potential interpretations of the gospel. One basically gives you a rigid set of rules to live by. And the understanding is that the gospel is only available to you if you live according to those rules. And the other is essentially the opposite. It's one that says the work of the gospel is done. Therefore, it doesn't matter what I do, right, wrong, or otherwise. The outcome's already set. And so it's a gospel that gives you the freedom to do whatever you want. And if you think back on the earliest interpretations of the gospel and the way people got it wrong, it kind of falls into those categories. Even in the Bible, in the New Testament, there were those who were rigidly committed to the rules and to the law, and they were expecting him to grant the messianic deliverance that they wanted, to honor their rigidity to the rules. His deliverance was going to be a response to their rules in the rule keeping. His deliverance was going to be conditional. And so it was a sort of legalistic interpretation of the delivery that the Messiah alone can bring for the people of God. And then there were others who were basically sort of zealous and rebellious and just kind of wanted to do their own thing. And their gospel was more a gospel of the world. And so in the Old Testament, you had a gospel of the law. In the New Testament, you had a gospel of the law being interpreted by the law keepers, the Pharisees, Sadducees, the religious system. And then you had a gospel of the flesh, or a gospel of the world, where basically people were trying to do what the world said was right and good and to satisfy the flesh and human ego and human authority, and then make the gospel fit that. And then there's this gospel that Jesus actually preached, which Frank calls the gospel of the kingdom of Christ. So that's the high view of the distorted gospels. And the problem of the distorted gospels is that most of the time we don't know, and I say we in a general sense here, the people with the distorted gospel are probably not aware of the fact that they have a distorted gospel. And at the very least, they're just ignorant. At the very worst, they are dogmatically, completely devoted to this ideology. And anyone who challenges that is a threat to them. Because if you think about it, there are certain things that we just need to be sure about in life, right? Like, you need to be sure that if you jump up in the air, you're going to come back down. It's something that is so much a part of our lives that we just wouldn't be able to comprehend what it would be like to jump up in the air and keep going. That would either mean that we turned into Superman or gravity changed in some way. And so the thought that we've been doing it wrong all our lives is very unsettling for people. And it isn't that in their heart they don't know that there's a possibility that they've been seeing this the wrong way. It's that they can't live with that possibility. And that's the problem with so many people's distorted view of things, is to embrace the gospel of the kingdom. If all your life you've always embraced either this licensed gospel or a libertine gospel or this legalistic, rigid gospel of the law, if that's all you've ever known, and then someone comes along and tells you, well, what if you've been wrong about that? What if you've just been told wrong? I feel like we've had this conversation before, by the way. I think I used this example many episodes ago because I remember telling you about this. Up until about 3 years ago, I was convinced for almost 30 years that I had a hiatal hernia.
Oh, yeah.
Did I tell you that story?
Yeah, I remember this.
I had been convinced because a doctor told me in a media care center 30 years ago, well, you've got a hiatal hernia. And I said, well, okay, that explains what happened and why I have these symptoms, And then I had these tests run that were sort of parallel to what needed to be to determine that diagnosis for sure. And just as a sort of side thing, the doctor who did these tests a couple of years ago said, oh, by the way, you don't have a hiatal hernia. You've never had a hiatal hernia. I don't even see scar tissue in there. You have had, and he gave me some word that I've already forgotten, and he explained all the things that I had assigned to this hiatal hernia diagnosis that was just given off the cuff by a doctor in an immediate care center on a Tuesday night when he'd probably be rather home watching TV or something,
Sure.
And so there I was carrying this distorted view of my condition all these years. And it wasn't a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but it was kind of unsettling to think that all these years I was sure I knew what was behind my symptoms, and I was wrong. And it wasn't a big deal. And yet there was this, like couple of hours that day when I had to just kind of go, that's wild,
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
imagine heaven or hell's riding on that.
Right. Yeah. I was wondering that too as I was planning the lessons for this specific topic. And I thought, if Jesus were to come today and he were to preach the true gospel, how many people would look at him and go, no, that's not what I learned, right? Or like, that's not right. That's not how I view things. And I just wonder. I wonder. And I think it's good to be self-reflective like that, to say, okay, well, what version of the gospel am I actually believing here?
Yeah.
And so I've got Frank's book in front of me, and I thought it might be helpful just to read like a couple sentences where he lays it out very clearly. And really, it is what you said, but it's concise. And I just wonder if there's like some words that might stick with people in a way that's a little bit different. It's on page 25, but he says this first camp, which would be that legalistic camp, he says it consists of those whose relationship to Jesus is understood to be an allegiance to external rule keeping. These people may not realize it, but they are in bondage to religious duty and obligation. And then the second camp, which would be that libertine camp that we talked about, he says it consists of those whose relationship to Jesus is understood to be a supplement to their already busy lives. Believing in Jesus makes them feel a little happier and helps them deal with sad days. But Jesus isn't really central to their lives. These people may not realize it, but they're in bondage to their own desires. So what I thought was interesting is that people in each of these camps are in bondage to something of the world. They're either in bondage to rules or they're in bondage to themselves and their own desires, which in a way is kind of making us the God of our own lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I found that really interesting. And it takes quite a bit of self-awareness and some deep digging to connect with one of these two camps. When I was in class last week and we were talking about it with the kids and the adults both, they would look at it and they would say, "No, I'm definitely not this camp." I'm like, maybe I relate to one or two of these things, but like, I'm not in this camp. And they were really smart and they thought, well, neither of these seem right. I think there's a third camp. They knew that without me even telling them that, which was cool. But something interesting was that almost everyone in the room, or at least everyone who shared, connected more with the legalism versus the libertinism. And so I just thought I'd share that here because I have a feeling that we might talk a little bit more on the podcast about legalism than libertinism, but maybe not. I don't know. We'll just see kind of where it goes.
Yeah.
But I found that interesting that most people, at least in the sample size that I had last week, 16 or 20 people, most of them related to that, the more legalism.
Yeah, I think you're going to find that in our little community of faith because I think we tend to lean in a more conservative direction. And, this day and age, I think this season has passed in our country, not entirely, but I think that the height of this conservative versus liberal diatribe that had been going on for a long, long time, it was really messing up our nation, by people just camping out in these two areas and hating each other. But I digress. The thing I'm driving at is that I think we can agree that while there is a conservative tendency in this congregation and this community, it doesn't really mean that we're a bunch of right-wing fanatics, It's all a matter of perspective, really. And then you would probably find that among communities where there's greater liberality. I mean, like, you think of places like Portland, Oregon or whatever, and you think, well, there's a lot more liberal mindset there. And it doesn't mean that everybody's just off the chart, ridiculously left wing or whatever. So we have to be reasonable and considerate of each other when we use these terms. But when it's all said and done, you're absolutely right. In our congregation and in our community, the conversation will probably tilt more towards legalism because there is a sense of security that conservative people get in foundational rules and regulations, like there's a tendency to just say, this is the way it is and that's that. And I get on with my life. We like boundaries if we're conservative, right? We appreciate boundaries, not because we want to be bound, but because we want to know where the limits are. And everyone, even the most liberal-minded person, is going to agree that boundaries have their uses. If there's a great precipice that you're going to fall off and die, you appreciate it if somebody puts up a fence and says, don't go past this line or you will die, and it doesn't matter how free-spirited you are and how libertine you are, you're going to say, yeah, it's probably a good thing that you can't just walk off that cliff. But there'll be that guy or that gal who will tie a rope to that fence and slide down that rope because they're going to see what's at the bottom of that precipice anyway. And so that's the reality, right? And so I don't know, that's kind of an extreme response to your statement, but you're right. In our little world, people are going to tend to think of terms that are more legalistic, and yet we have to be kind with that term then. And we have to say, it's like everything else in life, there's a spectrum, right? There's an extreme legalism, and then there's a general legalism, and for most of us, legalism isn't extreme. It's just about boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we want to, and I think if we're talking to people about this in our classes today, their question is going to be very reasonable. Okay, well, if the gospel isn't contingent on what I do or how I do it, then how do I reconcile that with the people who argue that that means you can do whatever you want? And that's because we tend to internalize the sort of Jewish view of I won't say gospel in this case because we think of it in terms of Jesus, but the Jewish view of righteousness is that in the eyes of God you are righteous because you keep the law. In the eyes of Jesus, we are righteous because we put our faith in him. And that's the fundamental difference, right? So we may consider ourselves legalistic in light of the gospel, but if we are honest, we don't want a gospel that it isn't really good news, which is what the word gospel means, right? So the good news isn't very good news if it still depends on how well you keep the law. It's good news when you realize that you don't have to be the one who determines whether you've done it well enough or not. God looks at his son, Jesus, and says, this is my son and whom I am well pleased. And because of that, and because of his love for you, I see you the same way. That's good news.
Mm-hmm.
That's good news. That says God sees you favorably because you have put your faith in his son with whom he is well pleased. And that good news then asks you to do nothing in order to be saved from God's just wrath, but it does ask you to do something. And now there's the question. What is it asking us to do? And for most of us who have embraced the heart of the gospel, that question is the one that vexes us because we're trying to figure out, well, what are we supposed to do then? How are we to live? Does this mean that we don't have to worry about whether we've done something wrong or something that displeases God? And if we don't know what the boundaries are, this freedom is kind of scary. And so for the person who is true Christian, but tends towards a legalistic gospel, the boundaries become really important, but they're narrower than they need to be. And so the gospel, according to the New Testament, is deep and wide, and it means that you may never find the boundary, but, Jesus did define that. He did say, for example, well, there is one sin, and that's to deny the Holy Spirit. You do that, you're pretty much out of bounds. You're in trouble. And we've talked about that in other episodes, but so I don't know. This is a hard one to flesh out for me because I don't want to just ramble on, but I do want to try to illustrate that what we're looking for if we're legalistic in our thinking, but we understand the true meaning of the good news of Jesus Christ, is we're looking for a way to live within the gospel that informs our decisions about what's right and wrong, what's good and what's evil. And the difference between the Old Testament legalism and the New Testament legalism is the Old Testament legalism says that our very salvation depends on how well we define what's good and evil and how we make our decisions. The New Testament interpretation of the gospel in legalistic terms says, can I lose my salvation? That's the kind of extreme view, because I don't keep the rules well enough. Or at the very least, am I always displeasing and disappointing God because I never make the right decisions? And that's the harm that I see in having a legalistic view of the gospel. And of course, the libertine view, I won't talk about as much since we're kind of talking to our crowd in a way. And I mean, no disrespect to the others, but if you live a libertine gospel, you're basically saying anything goes, everything pleases God. Well, that can't be true. God isn't pleased with sin. God isn't pleased with behavior that causes harm. The Bible is consistent from the Old Testament to the New Testament on a couple of things. One of those is God does not like oppression. God is the one who brings cosmic order, and God recognizes his enemy's presence wherever there's chaos, death, destruction, decay. So a libertine gospel would assume that God isn't going to punish you even if you do something that oppresses other people, or if you create chaos, if you defy his cosmic order. Well, God's clearly not going to be pleased with that. And so even if you feel that you've been saved by the gospel of Jesus Christ, but you still think that you have the liberty to do whatever you want, even if it defies certain core character traits of God, then you're probably outside of the gospel of even the so that's it in a nutshell, right? How'd I do? Sum it up for me.
Well, I think pretty good. Yeah, this is a hard thing to flesh out. I mean, we're talking about legalism and libertinism, and really, it's a spectrum. It really is. Like, the true gospel is in there. Nope, I want to take that back. The true gospel is the true gospel. And I think that, the Bible says that it's the straight and narrow path, right? It's a very narrow pathway. And so you kind of have to fall in the middle here in a way to know who Jesus is and to follow that true gospel. But then, of course, you can lean one way or the other, legalism versus libertinism. And so what we're saying is characteristics of one or the other. But what we want you to hear, too, is that, like, there's good intentions for all of these people, I like to think, right? So, like, there's good intentions if someone is legalistic. They want to follow the rules. They want to seek God, and they think that this is how I need to do it, right? I need to follow the rules. I need to go to church. I need to do these things. And these things are not wrong and they're not bad, but it's when it starts to get skewed where you're worshiping the rules more so than worshiping God. That's a problem. That's idolatry, right? You're worshiping something that's not God. And so you think, oh, I got to go to church because it's this certain day, or, it's a sin if I don't do this or whatever. And it's like, well, where did Jesus say that? Right? Like, look at the Bible. The Bible is our roadmap here. And the same goes for these libertine tendencies of like, well, I just go to church whenever because I know that God loves me. I'm just going to, talk to people like this or do whatever I think is right and just kind of live my life and just kind of go about things. But, I know that God loves me. And that can lead to, dare I say, like hypocrisy. Right? And so people who are not Christian look at these people and they're like, well, what's the difference between your life and mine? Why would I even want to do that? What's the big deal here? What do you believe? Right?
Yeah.
Oh, I believe in love.
Well,
God does ask more of us than that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what you were saying, and I think you did it well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're doing really well here is we're circling the rim.
Yeah.
And now the basketball's getting ready to drop through the net, because here is what Frank wants us to see, is these are three gospel interpretations that all assign kingship to something or someone. All right. So the Lord of legalism is the law, or these customs that we live by that we interpret as the cause and effect of our righteousness. The Lord of libertinism is the flesh. I let my flesh rule. And then there's the third gospel, the real gospel, and it's the gospel of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And who is the king in a kingdom? Well, let me back up. I mean to say that if it's a kingdom, there's a king, and the king of the kingdom of Jesus Christ is Jesus Christ. So we're talking about three gospels. One where the Lord is the law, one where the Lord is the flesh, and one where the Lord is Jesus Christ. And so that's what he wants us to drive to. So now the ball's dropped through the net. Now what we're really interpreting here is what the Insurgence is really about. It's about who you serve. And when you serve the law, now for a modern Christian, it's hard to really wrap your mind around that. But when you serve the law, well, here's what it really looks like. And I see it every time I go to church on Sunday, wherever I go to church, wherever in this community you set foot in a church, you're going to see this legalism or this Lord of the law. The law is the traditions. It's the dogma. It's the thing that you do because you just associate righteousness with these behaviors, these things you don't do, these things that you do, these things that you honor, these traditions you have. You know, we've talked often about this community we living in having a very strong Catholic representation. And both of us having been raised in Catholic Church, it doesn't really stray that far from our topic to say that we will assume in a few weeks when Lent begins that if we eat meat on Friday, we have violated some tradition that takes away our righteousness. You know, we will assume that if we don't go to the church's fish fry, that we're out of alignment with God, right?
Right.
And that isn't the law of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is the law of local tradition. That is the law of a religious tradition. I'm not putting it down. And believe me when I tell you that, you know, while we don't have anything like that in our Methodist tradition, there are plenty of Methodist traditions that people hold, and even more sort of, this is the way I grew up and this is how I expect church to be, you know. So we may not have specific things we point to, so I don't want anybody to think I'm picking on the Catholics. It's just that was low-hanging fruit and I went for it.
Sure.
The reality is every church, every religious community, and if we're honest, every place where people gather in community, there are traditions and norms. That's what sociologists would call it, is societal norms. These are just things we all do because it's what we all agree or expect to do.
Right.
And those are not necessarily in keeping with the law of the Old Testament or the gospel of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. They are our traditions. So I guess I'm probably going, you know, I'm trying to push that basketball back out again. I don't mean to do that, but I'm just saying that if you're going to be honest about what this legalism thing looks like, this Lord of the law, it is a law that is not written so much in a book somewhere as it's written in our hearts and minds, as our family tradition, as our community tradition, as our institutional tradition. These are laws in themselves, even if they're not written laws. There's this sense that I'm out of sync with the people that I want to have in my life. So I want my friends at church to respect me, so I dress the way they dress. I show up when they show up. I do what they do. And they are doing the same with me. And so somehow we're affirming each other in a tradition that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the Bible's truth about God's salvation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a law, and it's just not the same law that we think of in the Old Testament Judaism.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm stuck on this fish fry thing. And I just want to complete the layup that we're doing, that we took the basketball out of the hoop for just a second and then it's going to drop back in. But I think we could do an entire bonus episode on the fish fry thing.
Yeah.
Because what a perfect example of libertinism disguised as legalism. right?
That's really brilliant. I like that.
What a mental exercise. Like, I'm actually feeding my flesh because these fish fries are delicious. Like, I've
Yes.
gone to many of them. They're amazing. They give you like a trough of food.
Uh-huh.
But then you're like, well, but I'm supposed to eat fish on Fridays and I'm giving back to the church. What a great thing to do. Right? But it's like, I don't know.
Oh, well, that's a brilliant insight and it does sort of segue into how you can take a modern interpretation of the libertine gospel.
Yeah.
Because the libertine gospel basically distorts the spirit of the law. Like, so Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and in other conversations after the Sermon on the Mount, he says, you guys observe every jot and tittle, or every dot over the I, every cross in the T of the law, and yet you have completely missed the spirit of the law, right? And what he's saying, in effect, is what you just described. He's saying, for the sake of tradition and the law, we're going to abstain from meat on Friday, but for the sake of our flesh, we're going to eat more fish than our bodies can hold.
Right.
Because it's only once a year, and this is one of the things I look forward to is the fish fry. And you've distorted it. You've honored the spirit of the jots and the tittles, the dots and the crosses of the law, and yet you've applied a libertine approach to it. To give a biblical example, when Jesus says to the Pharisee, he's speaking in a context of Pharisaical interpretation of marriage and divorce. And he says, look, you say that a person can have a divorce if the husband grants a letter of divorce. What I say is if you even look at another person's spouse with lust in your heart, you have committed adultery. So what he's saying is they observe the dots and the crosses of the law by saying that as long as you take this human interpretation of the law and apply it, you're excused from the adultery that comes from casting off your wife and children so that you can have a new friend. Jesus says, no, the spirit of the law says it's sin, period.
Yeah.
Now, in that context, he isn't speaking to anything that would be a subject for a different conversation. And so I want to stay on the task. In other words, there's a whole other lesson about Jesus's hard teachings. And we definitely could do a podcast episode or two on that. But this hard teaching in its context is really pretty straightforward. Because he says, and this is what we fail to do a lot of times with the words of Jesus, we don't read the entire passage. We just read the verses that we want to take issue with. What he was saying in that context was, you have said that a person can get divorced as long as they have gone through the proper channels. I say, no, the spirit of the law says casting off the people that you made a covenant commitment to without justification, that God would view as justification, is different. And that's a very short and superficial interpretation of his statement. But bringing it back around to the fish fry thing, Jesus would say, you say that you can eat all the fish you want as long as you eat it on Fridays when you're not supposed to eat meat. And I say the spirit of the law it's a fast. It's a time to deny yourself so that you can reflect on the meaning of your salvation and the cost that was paid. So he's just asking you to see the true nature of things. And that is obeying him as the king or the Lord, instead of obeying our flesh as the Lord or a religious tradition as the Lord.
Bingo. I let that one hang there for a second because I think it's so important. Which really brings us to the third gospel, the one true gospel. Jesus is Lord of my life. God is Lord of my life. And it really almost takes specific examples from our lives and questioning, when I do this, is Jesus Lord of my life? When I make this decision, whatever it is that you're looking at, is Jesus Lord of my life here? What's my priority? Do I care more about what other people think? Is that why I'm choosing to do this, that, and the other? Right? Who am I serving here? The
Mhm.
law, my flesh? Am I serving Jesus?
That's really good. I like that because it just made me think that another way you could interpret the difference between the three gospels is legalism is obedience to what other people think. Libertinism is obedience to your flesh. And the gospel of the kingdom is obedience to the Lord Jesus Christ. Because legalism is us trying to conform for the sake of our social standing.
Mm-hmm.
And libertinism is us saying, I don't need to conform to anything. I'm just going to do whatever my flesh desires.
Yeah.
Because you made a really good point a minute ago when you're talking about how there's this distortion because both are present at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Because the libertine is honoring their own flesh, but at the same time, they're doing it in community too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't see really sort of, I'm trying to avoid terms that distort in people's minds, but you don't go to places where there's a real libertine sort of quality in the community or institution without seeing them rallying together for the sake of their flesh, so they embrace a sort of communal acceptance that's built around the idea that anything goes, and but I think I'll just leave that alone for now. So you accurately portray the idea with your fish analogy, because basically people are observing the law on one hand and they're being libertine on the other hand. They're doing both at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
What's the fundamental driving force, though? And that I do think can be, so it's like we talk about spectrums, like the software that we're using to record this podcast. If you turn up certain channels or frequencies, that will automatically turn down others, that they can't coexist or they cancel each other out. So inevitably what happens when you're dialing up when you have multiple settings for something like an audio recording, the understanding, whether you like it or not, whether you understand how it works or not, literally that when you turn one dial to the right, it makes the other dial turn to the left. It's just how that works. And that's what we're really talking about here is you may lean harder towards the libertine gospel, but you are not entirely libertine because that would be pure anarchy. And the pure libertine would be the one who lives alone on an island somewhere or up on a mountain somewhere and isn't accountable to anybody for anything.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't want to live that way. And if you live in society, you submit to certain boundaries and rules in order to coexist.
Right.
And so the same could be said of a purely legalistic situation. I hate to say it, but a pure legalism would be prison. So the libertine lives alone on an island and the pure legalist lives in a cell, in a prison. Or when you look back on the early days of Christianity, in the days of the church fathers, which would be like 300 years after Christ, then there were people who were trying it different ways. And there were the ascetics who lived in caves in isolation because they were trying to live in cells, essentially, to be purely legalistic.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were libertines who were living the gospel in places like Rome, who were trying to mix the Roman religion and the Roman civic culture with the gospel. And both were existing. And so these were things that were happening within 300 or 400 years of Christ's resurrection. And that was what the church fathers were contending with is, surely the extremes in both directions can't be right. So where is this gospel of the kingdom anyway? And oh, by the way, this book will deal exactly with what I was just mentioning.
Absolutely, because Jesus dealt with all of that, right? We see how Jesus speaks to the Pharisees. They were very legalistic. We see how he addressed that with them, and we see how Paul addressed the I guess libertinism of like the Romans. They were serving all these gods and doing all of these things. And so Jesus came down at the exact time that he planned, right?
Yeah.
In the world. And yet what he's saying exists outside of space and time. It does still speak to us today in certain ways. And so when Jesus came, I mean, he turned the world right side up.
Yeah.
From the day he was born is my belief. Right?
Yeah.
From day one. Yeah. And we talked about that a little bit last week. But this gospel that Jesus preached, of course, he said earlier, gospel means good news, right?
Yeah.
And so Frank, he talks about this third gospel on page 37, if you do have the Insurgence book. But he says this gospel is good news. It's not good advice. It's not good philosophy or good ethics. It's not good religion, good morality, or good views. It's good news. And it literally turned people's lives around.
Mhm.
Like it was, I mean, mic drop, I guess, in the culture if they knew what microphones were, which they didn't have them. But, Jesus, Paul, the apostles, they preached this gospel. They firmly believed in this gospel. And I think their sacrifice and their willingness to be tortured and killed for the sake of the gospel is one of the biggest, I guess, testimonies to the validity of Jesus and the gospel, right? Because like they were willing to go to absolutely the end of the world for Jesus. They walked with him, they talked with him, they knew him, they loved him, they learned from him, and they were willing to do whatever it took to tell other people about him. I mean, that's good news. That's the real deal.
And the benefit of what they did, the consequence of what they did, is the heart of this insurgence idea and the gospel of the kingdom. Because basically, what they were willing to do at any cost was proclaim the gospel of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And they kept doing it because it worked.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to put it in perspective because in our times right now, we are really looking at a world very much like the Rome that existed in that day, where, well, as a matter of fact, just the other night I was talking to somebody who said, well, I believe that basically there's just one God and we just all call him by different names. It's a kind of libertine interpretation of things. And I want to say, well, in that particular case, it was not necessary. It was not appropriate. So I didn't say anything really except, I hear you. But I was thinking in my heart, no, you really have that wrong. That would be, there'd be nothing revolutionary about the gospel of Jesus Christ if that were true. Because these people you just described were going into these countries where people had religious systems that were wild and bizarre occult practices that were terrifying in their nature. And then there were other less offensive, but no less incorrect, which would have been like the worship in Roman culture of Caesar as God and stuff. And, it was a sense that if you paid tribute to Caesar, you were acknowledging him as God. And it all seemed pretty harmless. And, you do this thing once a year and then you get on with your life and you don't have to believe it's true. But what was happening was that they were preaching the gospel of the kingdom that caused people to give all of that up and to put their lives at stake, giving all of that up. So what is it about the true gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel of the kingdom of Jesus Christ, that makes people give up religious systems that they were getting a certain sense of liberty or sense of comfort by the boundaries? In one way or another, they were getting something that gave them comfort, and they were willing to give up their comfort with that because of what these guys were preaching. And that's what we've got to tap into, because then we're part of the insurgents. Then we're part of upsetting the status quo. And one of the things that happens is when we say, no, there isn't just one God with many names. We don't live in a pantheon where we call God whatever we want God to be and accept that God meets us where our beliefs are, like God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And Jesus is God in the flesh. Jesus is God's plan of salvation manifest in a man, and God finished that work through Jesus, and Jesus reigns now over a kingdom that exists not in earthly boundaries, not in national borders, but in the presence of his Spirit in every believer, so that wherever his people are, his kingdom is. And his kingdom reigns above and beyond local principalities. His kingdom reigns above and beyond whatever we see happening around us. It is the thing that causes people to say, then I don't want the fish fry religion or the Methodist, we always did it this way religion or whatever. It's people saying, I can't be satisfied with that anymore. See, that's the problem. We fail to recognize that the gospel of the kingdom caused Peter, for example, to say, well, Lord, where else would we go? Now, that's a really powerful story. It's probably a good place to kind of start wrapping this one up, because next time we're going to have to start talking about what the gospel of the kingdom is and how we claim it and how we live it, But what was it that caused people to give up what they had always believed was true and got comfort from about that gospel? What was it that caused them to walk away from it at the cost of everything that mattered to them? Let's look at the Apostle Peter. So his name was Simon. He was a fisherman. He had a wife. He had a mother-in-law. They lived in a house together. They had a prosperous business, or at least they were making it. And it depends, if you watch The Chosen, then, it looked like he was having a little difficulty for a while there. But anyway,
Yeah.
In any event, he had a life that was defined clearly for him by his religious and civil culture. And he comes to Jesus because Jesus has shown him something bigger and greater. And his life with Jesus leads him to slowly grasp that there is a different version of the messianic gospel than the one that he has been led to look to all his life. And then one day, when Jesus says some things that are just too hard for the legalists to take, too hard for the libertines to take, because he's talking about the gospel of his kingdom, the Father's kingdom, and they leave him. And then he looks at the different apostles around him who are still there, including Peter, and he says, what about you? Are you going to leave? And Peter says, Jesus, where else would we go? See, that's when you know, is when you realize that nothing about what you once valued holds water for you anymore. You can no longer get peace of mind from that anymore. You know that the only source of true peace, the only source of true personal righteousness, the only source of hope for eternity is Jesus Christ and his kingdom. And once you realize that, you can never go back. And that's why people would travel the world and lose their lives for the sake of that message. That's why people will give up religious, cultural norms that have given them comfort all their lives and given their families comfort for generations. That's why they do it, because they've embraced something that they can't let go of. It's kind of like when you grab an electric fence on somebody's farm. It's hard to let go, and that's what it's like.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that's a great place to wrap up today. And I have all kinds of thoughts, but I think we'll get to them next week.
Well, I think we got to pace ourselves, since we're trying to keep in alignment with the study that we're doing with our friends here at Shiloh. So listen, if you're not a Shiloh person, first we'd just encourage you to pick up the book. You can get Insurgence, Embracing the Gospel of the Kingdom, on Amazon, on anywhere where books are sold, as they say. It's available in Kindle or digital format. It's available in audio format. It's an easy read, and by that I just mean that the way Frank laid out the book, you can read a few chapters at a time, and you really, can digest it slowly and keep pace with it. Where I've read novels where the chapters are 40 pages long and I'm trying to get through a chapter and, my eyes are crossing, but this doesn't read like that at all. I told him once that it seemed to me like the Insurgence book was a collection of blog posts. And he said, well, I like what you mean by that as far as its format, but it isn't it is continuous. It is a complete book in itself. So it isn't a collection of blog posts, but it's like reading a collection of blog posts. You can take each chapter or 2 or 3 at a time and then, move on to something else and then come back to it. And if you listen to it on audio, it'll get through it pretty quickly. But we really want to urge you to get the book, visit Frank's website, visit our Shiloh website. You can join us online while we preach and teach the gospel of the kingdom here at Shiloh in Jasper, Indiana.
Thanks for listening.
See ya.
Bye.